You're listening to Adventure Party for the second week of February 2024. This week, the party discuss resources and whether rationing your fun leads to a better gaming diet. The Adventure Party, discussing tabletop related gaming the Irish way. Welcome to the party. I'm Warlord Scar.
I'm Dave.
And I'm Liam.
And here we're talking about a topic that I honestly thought we'd gone over like many times in our 13-year history. But apparently, when checking for it, apparently had not come up before. And that's the topic of resource management and how it ends up in games of many a type.
We've probably touched on it in episodes, but yeah, no episodes devoted to the topic.
I do recall fellow host Savage, being quite a fan of the sheet and tracking every single little piece of straw that needs to be kept for the horses. And to me, that sounded like hell.
Yeah, that's one of the things. Is like it is one of those these elements of a game which tends to be polarizing in that you'll have some people who are for it, some people who are very much against and say it's just getting in our way, and then you'll get very odd things where someone may very much not like tracking, rations or how many 10-foot spikes you have in your backpack, but would be very pernickety about hit points for spells or how many lands you've played in a Magic game, double checking everyone's math on a board game, or these kinds of things. And it's always a thing of like, where do you split the difference in a game? The thing about resource management ultimately is that it's a sort of a tap or a limiter on what a player can do at any one time. And that's always going to be controversial. People will accept that they can't do 15 actions in a round, or that they can only draw one card per turn, or these kinds of things.
Most players,
yeah. But there's always going to be some. It's always going to feel like, oh, I just want, like, because you want the things. You want more cards. You want more mana. You want more spells, etc. You want all these things, but there's the psychological appeal of having it versus the psychological yearning for I'm going to get it next turn. I'm going to get everything next turn, or what have you. So the resource management is always kind of in an odd place in terms of psychology.
I think that there's a certain kind of balance to be struck on it, because I know certainly players often feel like it can be a trap. Okay, so this next section of the module, we're going to be going across mountains. Now, can I just say we go to the mountaineering shop and say, hello, we're going to cross these mountains. Can you give us like enough for 4 people to get across it? Yeah, that's fine. That's okay. And we're not both going to sit here and go through every piece of mountaineering kit. Whereas, if you were to insist that they do every little bit, and then next of all they get up into the pass and they're missing that one key piece of kit, haha, you got them.
There's a few takes on that. I mean, first of all, some players will absolutely insist on nailing down every last bit of gear, so they are prepared for anything that could crop up. As a broad principle, I think rewarding player preparation and ingenuity is a good thing. That said, I don't love the idea of screwing over people if they miss something that their characters would find obvious. I think this is the gear that is normally brought by mountaineers or mountain travelers, so you should probably look into that. I think is a fair thing to have available to players.
Yeah, and like, here's the thing: if you're going to use history as your example of failed expeditions, you'll find them in the footnotes of history an awful lot of all the people who miscalculated how many iron rations, how many donkey shoes they needed to bring with them. But you won't hear very many grand stories of the guy who got 90% of the way to the Great Pyramids and then starved to death.
I mean, I disagree. One of the most famous expeditions of all time was a spectacular failure. was Shackleton's last journey on the Endurance,
There is that.
which because it was crushed, and then they ended up making a crazy journey across most of the South Atlantic. I mean, if anybody isn't aware of it, look it up, because it is one of those things that you'd swear they were making it up. Just what they managed to do.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of politics and national pride going on there, because it was the people who got there successfully that found their bodies afterwards.
Oh, I think you're thinking of a different expedition. That's the I'm going out and I shall be some time. No, everybody made it off Shackleton's expedition on the Endurance.
Oh, I'm thinking of Scott.
Scott, I think, yeah, that's who you're thinking of, yeah. No, that's where they all died.
If a player making a understandable mistake in universe really leads to a cool survival endurance adventure, like Shackleton of going across the waves or across the desert or whatever have you, and at the end they all make it out and they resolve to do it better next time or decide to retire never again. That's a story, but it's like you got 90% of the way to the thing, and then because you didn't carry the 2 on your calculations of donkey feed, you die here, your bones are never discovered. That's a different thing, and that's the problem with the gotcha. It's just like,
I think it can sometimes be enlightening as to the other hobbies that game writers or that module writers have when it comes to the section of the game that's in a mountain or at sea or anything like that, when suddenly all this kit that you've never heard of comes out and comes into play. Again, I think that's probably where player knowledge and character knowledge really should be brought in. And it's like, okay, well, I buy what I think, or maybe I consult an expert and I buy what they think would be reasonable for that mountain's range.
Yeah, to be fair, if you were going in an expedition to an unknown or poorly known piece of terrain, you would have to guess at what gear you need to bring, but you would have ideas on what might be applicable. And that only gets more awkward when you take fantastical or even outright magical, not even enemies, but flora, fauna, terrain. If there's rocks that every so often make gravity reverse or whatever, you could be the first person to stumble onto it and maybe make it out alive.
How do I make that continuously happen so I can get a nice system whereby my sled is balanced nicely between the anti-gravity rocks and the gravity rocks?
Yeah, you can get some interesting stuff there if you're playing around with things, but you rarely find a group that says like everyone likes when they think of something ahead of time, they put that on their sheet, and it comes up as useful in the middle of their expedition or whatever. Fewer people will be enthused of we didn't do the math on exactly how many rations we needed or how many feet of rope we needed, and it's a failure state that is harder to improv around, and the feeling stupid of getting it wrong is bigger than the feeling smart of getting it right.
Is this an issue that kind of disappears though as you go up in levels? Because when people
Yeah.
get up in levels, particularly in fantasy gaming, you got a lot more resources at hand, and you probably have extra dimensional storage space. So it's like, all right, well, we'll bring 2 months worth of rations. What does it matter? I'll throw it in the portable hole.
Well, even sci-fi games have that, depending on your point of view, issue or benefit. I remember one of the Cyberpunk Chromebooks had a segment on a modified digestive system, which meant it absorbed water with incredible efficiency. And there was a mercenary who was using it and said, "Oh, your colleagues might laugh at you for for having it," and then they realize that they're dying of thirst in the middle of the desert, and you're not.
Water is life.
Yeah. There's also the problem of where's the narrative impetus in a situation like that, because in that case, like presumably you're not exploring. It depends whether you're exploring for its own sake, in which case if you're just here, you want to see what's in that hex. Having to turn around and go back home after a few months might that be part of the process. That might be a learning experience you're willing to go on. But if you're specifically here to get to the Tomb of Horrors or the Lost Mine of Sokanth or whatever, and you have to turn around halfway through because you left one thing off your character sheet, it feels all of a sudden like like the mechanics or the realism of the world or whatever you want to call it are getting in the way of the narrative impulse, which is getting to that dungeon or adventure site or whatever.
I'm not sure I entirely agree with that because I think it reinforces the point that this is a difficult area to get to. Like, and only the best prepared and the most skilled are even going to reach this dungeon. I think that contributes to the verisimilitude of affairs.
Not everyone is as interested in verisimilitude as they are in pacing and a payoff. Like there's the like you get the sense of delayed gratification, much like when you're playing Magic and you have your key combo spell at 5 mana and you're just trying to get that 5th land and it's coming. And some people absolutely hate that, will never play a 5 mana spell. Some people optimize their decks, or some people just live on the anticipation of getting it. And these may be the more experimental players who only get their combo off once every 5 games, but it feels so good when they do. But yeah, you're going to have to think about, like, does a certain group of players want the anticipation? Is adding to the hardness to get of a location, making it feel impossible to get to, possible to get that treasure out of it? And does that make it more satisfying in the end? For some people, the frustration might outpace it. And
You get there, find it, and then have to leave and go back and get more supplies.
Yeah, which you can well afford with a bit of loot, but
Well, like you didn't even have the supplies to go in. You had to leave because you're like, oh, well, we got to go back. We'll already be having the last couple of days with no food.
it's going to feel different if you're in a very historical campaign where this kind of failed expedition is, as I said earlier, very common for people to save up, do their big expedition, find it didn't pay out, then have to crawl back to the home country and try getting new sponsors or whatever to get the.
Well, like the polar expeditions, like it wasn't even just like, all right, let's load up with everything and head for the pole. Like that was probably the fourth, expedition of that expedition. The first one you'd send out a team, and they'll get like a quarter of the way there, and they'll dump 3/4 of the stuff they have, or dump half the stuff they have there, and then head back. And then you'll send another team out to the halfway point. They'll dump a pile of stuff, and then they'll make their way back. And then you'll get guys to go the 3/4 way, and then they'll head back. And like you strung supplies along the way.
Yeah, like climbing Everest, having to make every base camp.
I don't see even the most pedantic of tracking everything groups being willing to do that.
I think there certainly would be people who would be up for it, but I certainly don't think it would be majority. That said, I could definitely see people who are up for some painstaking expedition of the 1 or 2 variety.
Well, here's the thing. Like, we're talking about, we're going back to our default of, your standard fantasy RPG, and you're going to what you say is a standard fantasy dungeon. We could probably assume that in a modern game, that this wasn't chosen by the players. This was chosen by the DM. DM bought a module that said, the module says, oh, this dungeon is 4,000 miles from the nearest civilization and takes many weeks to jungles, and here's a hex map of the jungle. Here's how to get it. Here's all the random encounters in the jungle. And
if the adventure is the point and the entire point, then the GM may as well hand wave or close to hand wave the actually getting their bit. I mean, there's nothing necessarily wrong with effectively setting a game even in media res, as in you've after getting this mysterious scroll and map and venturing through the jungle for months, you're finally at the gate of the tomb skull of destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's going to be some people who will appreciate that you've gotten to the point, as opposed to using every single glob of fat on the bone of this module that you've gotten. But there'll be some people who they're going to imagine a much more fun and satisfying version of the journey there, and they'll be wondering if they could have. Well, they probably weren't wondering, oh, would I have gotten the resources in line? They probably would have thought, oh, probably we're going to have some role-playing scenes and whenever we encounter someone on the way, or we're going to have some side scenes at the camp.
I think there you need to have a good match between GM and player expectations. Because if you've got a group who's very simulationist, very detail orientated, and a GM who's up for that, then you could have an entire campaign getting to that to that location.
Yeah, absolutely. A sub campaign of setting up each of those base camps, making allies among all the groups along the way, so that you could slowly build up for the final expedition to get the actual place and find the gem of Lochtar or whatever. That sounds like a perfectly fine campaign if you're up for it. But again, this is a me thing. It's just like I suspect a lot of the times you get a complaint about these things is because no one, neither GM nor player, really expected the slog to be quite as detailed and merciless as it turned out to be, and therefore they were taken by surprise. And the complaint is less that the scenario is unrealistic or pedantic, but more that they just weren't ready for it mentally.
You can kind of get a bit of a balance between the two. Like I have played a game where like the goal of the party was to set up a trade route between two countries, and we actually split it up into there was like a backer party who did all the politicking and securing resources and logistical stuff, and then there was a party that went off up into the mountains and kind of did the actual scouting part, which was very boring, but it was a good game. I like that it was people could self-select into the group that they'd actually like.
And again, I think that the process of selection is, if people adjust to the style that they're looking for, there's rarely a problem. But as I said, like if you're in a game where the GM is picking the module and they pick one which is not suited to the player, it can be very frustrating because you thought you had months of content here, and now the players are rebelling. I suppose, I guess, know thyself, know thy players is fine advice, but it can be just something to be aware of before it becomes a problem, I guess. But okay, so I had a specific thing, and this is more about what we might call combat resources, stuff like your spells, your special moves per day, your mana pool, your exhaustion pool, or even your hit points.
Potions that will sit in your character sheet forever.
Yeah, like your potions and that handy 10-foot pole that you're definitely going to get use out of someday. These are also resources, but I'm thinking more in terms of round by round resources. I go to an awful lot of OSR blogs. I don't always agree with what they're there, but it is always interesting to see them theorizing, because it's a type of theorizing you don't see as much in contemporary bloggers, because they're often worried about storytelling advice and how to run a mystery and this and that, whereas an OSR blog might get a little bit more into psychology. And this is just something I noticed. One of them is the idea that, again, this is probably them, reaching backwards into history and other things. But the idea would be that in the original fantasy games, your class wasn't so much your character as extra equipment you took along with you. That you had, like, you choose a fighter because you wanted extra hit points, and you chose a fighter because you chose a wizard because you want to have a spell. But that wasn't considered to be your primary way of doing things. Your primary way of doing things was engaging your brain, pulling out your wooden spikes or your garlic or whatever, and using that to solve your problems. And then when you actually, messed up and got into a real fight, then your character class was sort of a backup that you would bring in, and that was your extra resources that you're going to play with in that situation. But that clearly is not the way history went, and people have very much moved into a mode where your character class that you chose is a core part of everything your character does. You chose fighter not because you want to have extra emergency hit points, but because you wanted to be hitting people with a big sharp thing every round. You chose wizard not because you want to have one neat trick you could pull off once a day, but because you wanted to do magic stuff every round. And if that's just an interesting dichotomy between expectations there. I was wondering what people might thought about this. So like have we made resources too intrinsically tied to a character's role in an RPG?
I think that an argument could be absolutely made for that. Like, I don't disagree with your assessment on how popular game systems have evolved, but I don't think that is necessarily a positive move or one that should be universally accepted. I mean, certainly our OSR games very much, as you say, look to the older ways of doing things, for better or worse. like tying resources so tightly to a character class or your archetype, species, race, what have you. Like, yeah, it leads into a certain style of gameplay, but there are also other styles of gameplay. You don't necessarily have to have a character class at all. Out of recent games, I mean, the Black Sword hack has no character classes. It does have backgrounds, but they inform there are abilities linked to them, but it's somewhere between create your own character class and true classlessness, in my opinion. But it's an interesting little sword and sorcery take, anyway.
I think it's just part of the definition of what classes are. You know, if you think about it more in the rough way of its careers, I mean, you know, you think about it, actual real world career as well. You know, an electrician's probably gonna have a screwdriver light up when you stick current on it, or have a multimeter, and a carpenter will have different planes and everything. It's part of the tools of the trade, and same way for gaming. Whatever it is, if you're a wizard, you'll have a spell component pouch. If you're a fighter, you'll have some kind of, you know, magic sword.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm thinking about is like there's a sort of dichotomy between your class abilities as another resources versus them being a fundamental way of your character expressing themselves.
I express myself through my sword.
It's just a very different way of looking at it to say like a fighter is a person who uses a sword every turn versus the idea of a fighter as someone who has extra hit points to burn when things get down to a fight.
Well, that is the difference, though, because, like, I mean, with a lot of modern RPGs, there's not much stopping you being a wizard with a sword. You know, some kind of melee weapon. But what will be the difference is that the fighter will have the feats or will have the abilities that will make them better at it. Now, you can still, in most games, there might be a different class or a subclass that might be kind of good at it as well, so you can not going to suffer as much for dipping like that. But it's still kind of a primary thing. It's like you're going to be better at it.
Yeah. One thing I wasn't aware of until relatively recently was that, say in D&D, and the thief class was not one of the starting classes. There was fighter, magic user, and priest, which became cleric. But thieves was more of a job description than a class, as in there were thieves who happened to be fighters or one of the other two classes. As one player put it, lock picking wasn't really a thing. We just generally use crowbars to get rid of the locks, and
Is often faster, if albeit noisier.
Yeah, that's the thing. But for whatever reason, enough people wanted, some kind of rules around the thieving ability that it be basically blossomed into a class, and that class was relatively controversial for a lot of D&D's history. Not only because the mechanics didn't feel as satisfying as people imagined, but also because now that there were mechanics for picking locks, we did feel like no one else but a thief could pick a lock, and people were not happy about that. And that's sort of that you can almost say that's the start of this sort of change between the class being a capability, something that only specific characters can do, versus class as a resource. Well, actually, you could probably say that might be actually the priest, because no one else. Well, no one else could turn undead, but everyone could bring garlic, which worked on some undead. So it's always been fuzzy is the thing, like that. Like, I never said that this was a clear, definite dichotomy. It's always been a little bit fuzzy, but it is interesting to have an alternate way of to looking at a resource, and it does speak more to certain players who maybe like subverting their archetypes, like the guy who's playing the big dumb barbarian but really likes solving puzzles, so barbarian keeps picking up useful items and figuring out really cool ways to use them to beat problems, because they're seeing the character sheet as a resource rather than a set of capabilities.
like you say, like just because your sheet says you have a certain intelligence score doesn't mean you're forbidden from having your character act in any sort of intelligent way. It's an average of it's, as you say, a resource, or can be seen as such at least.
Yeah, like there's no strong divide between them. I think much like there isn't a strong divide between people who like micromanaging their They're iron rations versus people who just want to just start us at the door of the dungeon and let us go into the dungeon and don't make us track torches as well, because that's not what the dungeon is about. Dungeon is about exploring, not candle management.
I've been playing through Arent, and honestly, I find the entire process of supply and stuff just to be tedious and a pain in the hole. I still enjoy playing the game because I enjoy hanging out, playing games with my friends. But and certainly it was one thing that we went on our first expedition and we get there and then we realize, oh right, rather than a healer's kit, we should have got an armorer's kit, because the armorer's kit means that when we take our rest, we can repair all our armor and get all of our what did it call, ticks back. I can't remember what you call it when you take damage on your armor. Whereas the healer's kit is more of a long-term care thing. So basically, we ended up having a very short expedition and then going back and getting more stuff, and that was kind of a learner experience. But I mean, it depends how big a deal it is in the game. With that, it's everything. But I still enjoy it because I enjoy.
Yeah, like it's going to be very different for people. Like all these things, are they going to be deal breakers, or are they going to be just annoyances, or are they going to really add to verisimilitude? Some people really, really appreciate that those extra details, those little inconveniences can actually help to make them focus on the reality of the world. But for some people, that level of engagement is not what they want. They want to get to the crux of a thing. And similarly, some people are going to want to see the characters as a thing that they use every round. It's just like, I use my spells, I use my sword to show off the character they've made. Whereas other people are going to say, the character's useful, but like I don't want to be a limit of what I could do. I just want to have some as an extra thing I have on top of me being me and role playing this character the way I think they work. Do you have any more general thoughts on resource management in games and the benefits of delayed gratification or anticipation?
For me, anyway, it can feel very wrong leaving anything on the table, if you know what I mean. So if you're playing the current edition of Pathfinder and you have your 3 actions around and you only take 2 actions, it feels wrong. It feels suboptimal. I should be doing something with this last action. And same with, anything else where you're playing a rogue in 5th Ed and you haven't taken a bonus action. You're like, I feel like I should be doing something with this.
Yeah.
I'd agree in terms of very easily renewable resources. If that resource is going to be back next round, ironically enough, it feels like a waste if you haven't used it. Now, if it's a resource that's a bit harder to replace, like spells that you only get back after a good night's sleep, or a one-use potion, or something like that, or specialist ammo, that's a little more of an interesting question. And I think there's fun to be had in, right, do I use this now, or do I save this for fights I know are coming, or I think I know are coming? And I say fights, but challenges.
Will I use this very specific item in this very specific fight now, or will I save it for an even more desperate, very specific fight later on?
Well, and the thing is, I mean, Darkest Dungeon, I have to say, is one of my favorite PC games, and part of the reason is it manages to keep that knife edge of tension very well. Like you have to think about things like food and food and other supplies, and balance out about getting loot out and getting your characters out alive. And it doesn't surprise me that it was based on some of the more old school RPG games. As in they took it for inspiration, apparently.
Yeah. Ultimately, if you're doing a certain level of renewable resources, you're probably leaning more into a dramatic round by round challenge, and the emphasis is going to be on getting it right in this cycle of actions. And this is where you'll get a very complicated board game or a combo deck in a CCG. People are going to want that, whereas some people are going to want to engage more with the balance of long term resources. Like, if I do this now, I can't do this later. Is this the right time? So this is sort of where you get a situation where some people are just going to disagree with the resource management mechanics of your game because they don't engage with resource management on that level. And I don't think that's something we talk about enough is that people like I think the round to round resource versus the long term resources it's difficult for something to be able to do both satisfactorily to many different types of players. And a lot of games try a hybrid approach, and many RPGs have to because they are trying to be more generous and they are unable to fully commit to being the vermicellatudinous world of, things run out. If you break something, you break something, magic points don't come back, etc. Versus the, tactical combat of being in the fray in the moment. They can't ignore either of them because they're both, real things in the gameplay. People are going to have preferences one or the other.
I mean, for the player, like rations and all that kind of stuff, I found invariably with almost every group that's something that you kind of end up with a quartermaster, whether that's an official position, say like an errant, where you literally have someone who's to keep track of everybody's encumbrances and who's carrying what and all that, or whether that's just informal that one person ends up keeping track of it all. I find that that's generally what happens. In combat, it's kind of down to everybody to keep track of their own stuff, really.
I mean, if somebody thinks to remind other people, I mean, fair enough, but you shouldn't be relying on that.
Yeah, that can lead to armchair quarterbacking at time, or at least accusations of armchair quarterbacking.
Yeah.
Cast that spell. Shut up.
Yeah.
I have been guilty of that at times.
This is back to the personal thing where, like, how you spend your resources or your actions or what you do in your turn is not just a tactically optimal situation thing. It's also a show what your character does, what they're made of, how they deal with problems. So, it becomes a personal situation then. What resources will your characters waste to make a point is a compelling bit of personality trivia that people you often don't find out until you actually start to play.
Yeah, like finding out that mismatch exists between people's, like where people, as you say, interface with resource management, as in, are they more interested in the round-to-round tactical positioning? Pathfinder 2 is particularly good at that, I find. Or are they more interested in that long-term resource management of, battles are won by logistics, not by heroics, like kind of mindset? Like combat as war versus combat as sport comes to mind, but I mean, there's also happy mediums, apparently. And getting, like, the thing is, one size fits all just isn't going to happen, like with this or several other elements of RPGs.
Or any other game, yeah. There's going to be people who'll just never get into any CCG because they just want to have all the cards available and pick the point is to pick the right one. But then, as I say, most of the really popular games are going to have this balance of both, where you have your Warhammer, where you'll have once per game command points and single use rocket launchers, but a lot of it is going to be the cut and thrust of an individual unit, an individual turn. What do you do with this unit this turn? But there's also the long term question of what happens if this unit dies. And then, as I said, we have D&D, where you have your character as expression versus character as a bag of hit points and spells that'll run out. And Magic, you'll have your what do I play this turn versus what is my long term win condition for the deck.
Very few games will adequately mesh both, though. Like, I mean, even just thinking in terms of, I think Twilight 2000 and Twilight 2013 were the only games I saw that really kind of addressed it. There were almost certainly other ones that addressed the concept of like combat load. That by all means you can carry that 80 kilo rucksack, for an hour or two through the place, or you can probably more comfortably carry a 30 kilo rucksack, around the place. But if you're getting in a fight or you're getting in a gunfight, then you're going to be at severe penalties because you're looking around a big heavy rucksack when you actually come to a fight. You should be wearing maybe attack vest and maybe a gun, and that's it.
Yeah, well, I believe there are backpacks with quick releases for precisely to head off that problem. But even so, it's not going to take away fatigue from lugging around nearly your body weight in equipment, for hours and hours.
But most games just kind of assume that you have your stuff. At the start of every initiative, the start of roll for initiative. Okay, everybody, cut the straps or drop the straps on your backpack.
I mean, It is interesting to see this stuff addressed in games like Modern War, or I haven't actually looked at the new Twilight, but I imagine it becomes important.
Yeah. And as I said, that is one of the situations where if you are in that deep, realistic, every pound matters combat, it's going to feel very weird if, weight is not your resource to manage, essentially. So yeah, it's all going to come down to expectation, and you're not going to have a clean answer. It's a game design problem, but it's also, it is sort of the truth that all GMs have to become game designers at some point, just because of the way their game goes. You can't dial up the scenario writer if you're in the middle of a module and all your players are bored. It's something you're gonna have to deal with yourself. So we've put an awful lot of resources into this episode, and if you'd like to explain to us how that was a horrible waste of our time, you can hit us up on our social media or come check out our Discord. But for now, this party's over. Thanks for listening to the Adventure Party. You can find show notes and links to things we've mentioned at www.theadventuringparty.net and on our Facebook page. You can leave comments there, or talk to our Twitter account at AdventuringPTY, or you can record a voice message at www.speakpipe.com/theadventuringparty. We can also be contacted directly by email at party@theadventuringparty.net. If you'd like to be in touch with the party all the time, come join our Discord server, linked in the show notes. The Adventuring Party is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike version 3 license.